Thank you very much. Philip Coggan. I am the Economist, except no substitutions. So next week is quite a crucial one in the nation's economic history. I say that with some trepidation in that we've had a lot of weeks when we thought that was going to happen. But next week we will have 3 votes on Brexit. The first will be on Theresa May's deal, which, as you remember, lost by over 200 votes the first time round it was voted on, and it will probably lose, but by less than that on the Tuesday. Then there will be a vote on whether we have no deal at all, and that will probably be voted against. So the Parliament will vote against no deal. The third vote will be on whether to extend the Article 50 period beyond the end of this month. Now, there's a possibility that all 3 votes could lose, in which case we will be in an even bigger mess than we are at the moment. But we suspect that there will be an extension just because there isn't any time to pass the legislation, even if Theresa May's deal is finally accepted. But I think there's been a lot of publicity about the economic impact of no deal. Queues at the ports. The French customs officials have been going on a kind of work to rule, so we've got a bit of an image of it this week, funnily enough, because they don't feel they've been prepared enough for Brexit. But I think it's a mistake to focus on the short term. If no deal is avoided, then there probably won't be massive disruption, but it's not about really whether or not lorries have to queue. It's the long-term impact on economic growth that's important. Think more about the slow letting of air out of a balloon rather than the sudden explosion. And the reason it's important is that a lot of companies are in Britain, and we've seen that, of course, in the car industry in particular, because they see it as a base for trading in the EU. That's why they came to Britain. Mrs. Thatcher did a very good deal in persuading some of the car companies to come to Britain, and they simply don't understand why we would be leaving, and that is affecting their decisions. So you can see that with the figures on foreign, on business investment, and there obviously was a big slump around the time of the crisis, and then things gradually picked up again, and leading up to the referendum, there was a pretty steady upward trend. Once you got to the referendum, things started to crawl to a stop. And you can see there are some down quarters there, but the overall trend has flattened off. And that's particularly true in the car industry, where it's actually collapsed. And that's very important because you need to understand where long-term growth for the economy comes from. There's only 2 ways, really, of getting long-term growth. You can have more workers, and you can make those workers work better, make them more productive. Now, on that second one, which is probably the biggest key to long-term growth, you can see again that we have struggled to make ourselves more productive. There was a steady uptrend all the way from the mid-90s to the crisis, a plunge, and what you would have expected if things were normal is for that trend to resume, albeit, allowing for the dip. But instead, things have flattened out. We're not making ourselves more productive, anything like as quickly as we were before 2008. And what's very important in terms of being productive is recruiting foreign firms. Foreign firms come here with skills and technology that domestic firms don't have, and they make us more productive. Maybe a bit difficult to see the figures, but if you look, the firms without foreign direct investment are roughly less than half as productive as the ones with foreign direct investment. Those are figures from the Office of National Statistics study. So if we cease to attract foreign firms, because what's the point of coming to Britain? Why not go to Dublin or Frankfurt or Paris? Then our productivity performance is likely to become even worse. And as I say, there are 2 components of economic growth. And the puzzle, I think, again, that outsiders think, is that Britain has sold itself since the 70s. As you can tell, I was I'm older, and I can recall the 1970s and walking to school past picket lines and Britain being ungovernable. But from the 1980s onwards, we sold ourselves as a business-friendly base within the European Union. And now we have a Conservative Party in power, which seems not very friendly to business. I won't repeat the words Boris Johnson used, but you will know that he used the same terminology as he does to most young women who come into his orbit. And it's very odd if Conservative Party, the party of business, is not favourable to business and has become a kind of narrow nationalist party, because then the alternative is a Labour Party which wants to increase corporate tax rates, which wants to transfer 10% of the stake of the equity of large companies into the hands of workers, which doesn't really mean workers, because you and I wouldn't be able to sell our shares in it. It means the government. And which wants to nationalise some businesses without paying full compensation for that process. So again, if you're looking from the outside, you think here was this, attractive business opportunity which seems to have lost its senses. And that's the danger in the long run. So what about migration? If we don't have more productive workers, will we get more workers? Well, as you know, the demography of the country is that we are aging, that gradually the baby boomers in my generation are retiring, and we have not had enough children to replace them. But the key thing to keeping the population and the workforce growing has been migration. And again, in the course of the campaign, the Leave campaign, it was alleged that, of course, migrants were a burden on the public purse. But actually, the statistics show that the average migrant from the EU will contribute £78,000 to the public purse over their lifetime, and indeed just a bit more than £2,000 the year before last, than the rest of us. So if we all buggered off and left the migrants in charge, the place would be a lot more prosperous. And what we do know is they have driven up the overall size of the economy. The figures on GDP per person are less clear, certainly haven't worsened it, but there's no huge improvement. But the overall economy has got bigger. So what about the effect, you're probably thinking, on wages? Well, again, the analysis has been done, shows that the effect on wages, such as it is, and there isn't one in some sectors of the workforce, is only on the lowest quintile of workers, the lowest 20% of workers. And since 2004, the effect of that, of immigration, has reduced the wages of that group relative to what it would otherwise have been by about 1 percentage point. So it's an impact, and of course, if you're on low wages, any fall is significant, but it's not a dramatic one. Why is that? It's because, and this is something that they do teach you in economics, there's a fallacy called the lump of labour fallacy. Some of you may be familiar with. The idea that there's only so much work to go around, and therefore if somebody else comes and takes a job, then someone must lose it. But if you think about that, it's obviously nonsense. The world population in 1900 was about 1 billion, now we're 7.5 billion. Has there been mass unemployment because more people have been born? Clearly not. There wasn't a lump of work. In the 1960s and 1970s, it was often argued that women should not enter the workforce because they would take the jobs of men and men would be left without work. Clearly, there are a lot of women who join the workforce. There's not mass unemployment about men. Every person who takes a job earns money. When they earn money, they spend it on goods and services. That creates demand for other goods and services and creates more work. So that's the simple thing. The lump of labour doesn't exist. It can have an effect on wages, because if you have more supply, it can reduce wages. Now, this is a figure for real wages, and the yellow line is the nominal, the blue line is the real. And as you can see, in the last 10 years, basically, real wages in Britain have gone nowhere. One of the reasons that people are so upset with politicians, they do not feel they're getting prosperous. So is that to do with the EU or with immigration in the UK? Well, the problem with assuming that that's the issue is that this is a very widespread problem. So the OECD is the richest countries in the world, not just in Europe, all over the world. In the 10 years before 2007, start of the financial crisis, real wages in that area grew 27%. In the 10 years since then, they only grew 8%. So there's something happening in the economy that's not just to do with the EU or with immigration. What is that issue? The issue is that basically capitalism capital has won out at the expense of labour. So this is the share, these lines are the share of GDP going to workers. So you can see back in 1970, the figure was well over 50% in advanced economies, and it's dropped down for about 4 percentage points. In developing economies, it's been at a lower share. So more of the return from the economy has gone to capital and less has gone to labour. Why is that? Well, we can see that some workers have done very well out of it. So the black line there is the figure for the average person, the average worker, the 50th percentile. The red dotted line is the figure for the top 1% of workers. So the gains have gone almost entirely to the top, and the average person has won out. Now, the probable explanation for that is something called SBTC, skill bias technical change. The people who know how to come up with new technologies, the people who can exploit the new technologies, earn a lot more than the rest of us. It's a similar impact really to, and the internet makes that even more real. It's a similar impact really to the effects in football and in entertainment, where the ability for us now to see on television the top football stars or to hear via streaming services the top singers means that we all want to hear just those people. We don't just go and see our local team or just go to a concert hall and listen to the local singers. So they take nearly all the gains. And in certain professions, if you're well off and you have a legal action, you want the top lawyer, you want the top doctor to deal with you. So the rewards all go up to the top. And the difficulty we face then is how to boost that is to get the rest of us, the majority of workers, much more attuned with technology. And unfortunately, Britain has been particularly bad at this. So this is a OECD survey of the percentage of adults who lack the basic skills to cope with technology. And Britain is the worst in this range of countries. The OECD is over about 40% on average of workers don't manage it. We're up nearly to 50%. The Japanese are by far the best on this measure. So it's very difficult, therefore, to create skilled jobs and bring the workforce in if half of them aren't able to cope with the jobs that are needed. And the risk is, of course, that these jobs will be automated away and you will get this divide get even worse. So if there are kind of two schools of thought about what might happen with technology. One is it will solve all our problems and we'll all be, lying on sunbeds having robots feed grapes to us while we enjoy life. The other is that with this divide will be even greater and we will all be washing Bill Gates' socks and mowing his lawn or whatever, because the only jobs that will be available will be as servants to the wealthy elite. It'll be like Downton Abbey all over again, but with iPads. That's basically the fear for the future. So the result of this squeeze on real wages, as I'm sure you know from your work, is that in Britain, workers in poverty have been increasing. So again, you divide this graph into 3 full-time, part-time, and then the full-time self-employed. I think what stands out to me is the big jump in the problems of self-employed people. A lot more people went self-employed, particularly after the crisis. If you're middle class, you lost your job, you became a consultant. But The consequence of that is that you spend a lot of time, instead of going to work earning a salary, trying to drum up business and going around trying to find people to hire you, and you end up earning a lot less. But even in full-time employment, you'll see that the proportion of people in poverty has increased. And of course, the government has tried to tackle this, not very well, with the universal benefit system. But again, if you want to understand voter anger, just look at those figures. You'd think, when I was growing up, you'd expected the population to be getting better off year after year and poverty to be reducing, but it has been increasing. And people are also not very engaged with their work. So this is a Gallup survey. Only 11% of UK employees felt engaged with their work, and 21% are actively disengaged. So you've got, on average, I'm sure you're at much better firms, twice as many sort of mutineer employees as you've got enthusiastic ones. And of all the countries in Europe, only France and Italy have more disengaged workers than us. Again, so you've got workers who don't have the skills they need to get on in life, whose wages have been squeezed, and they actually don't think much of their jobs. This is not an entirely enticing combination. And work. Oh, the clicker has become disengaged from the... Can you do that at the back? Oh, thank you very much. The effect on personal finances has been significant too. So it's hardly surprising if your real wages are being squeezed and there are plenty of bills you have to pay for, that you aren't able to save as much. So this is a very long-term figure on the saving ratio. I should probably point over here for variety. You can see that in the 90s, people were saving up to 15% of their income and often more than 10%. But now we're down below 5%. This is among the lowest level we've had in the last 50 years. And of course, with the building society paying less than 1% often on your rate, on your savings, people aren't incentivized to save. But I think the underlying problem is they basically don't have enough spare income to be able to do so. And what does that likely mean? It likely means that household debt, which had been coming down in the last few years, this is the Office for Budgetary Responsibilities forecast, is started to head up and is going to keep heading up again, because there's no other way of making ends meet. Let them eat credit, as a famous economist said. So there is some good news for those of people who are saving, in the sense that fees are coming down on savings. I'm on the panel of the Economist savings scheme, and we've seen quite big falls in the charges we pay. But on a passive equity fund, you're now just paying 12 basis points, as against 0.75% on active funds. And so there's been quite big drops in recent years. Basically, automation and technological advance has some advantages in driving down prices. And there's plenty of scope for this to help happen elsewhere. Anybody who has tried to send money abroad will be massively frustrated with how much it costs when it's the same button to click when you're sending money to the US as it is when you're sending money around the corner. But there are companies like TransferWise which have significantly reduced the costs of international transfers. Mobile payments in a large part of the world have brought banking more cheaply and more accessible to lots of people. In things like websites like Money Supermarket and so on, which show prices, the effect of greater transparency has brought prices down. I think the most interesting question is, will all these firms be colonized by the big tech companies, Apple and Google? If you think about it, they know so much about us. We already have Apple Pay. Google knows everything we're doing all the time, and Facebook. And they therefore know whether we're good credit risks, if you start to think about it. And so they could move into finance quite easily. They probably worry about the regulatory aspects of doing it. So what you could see in the future is that you have a Google or an Apple or a Facebook financial product where they are the brand name, but the banks become the sort of underlying technology for it. So the banks are the kind of suppliers, and there the money will be made by the Apple and the Googles and not by the banks. So it's a long-term threat, I think. So I want to end with some good news. So more people in work than ever before. At work, it's safer. There are many fewer fatal accidents at work than there were even just 30-odd years ago. There are very few strikes. So labour relations have improved dramatically. That was the winter of discontent. I can remember that extremely well, when even people couldn't be buried for strikes. Hospitals were on strike. And there's a chance that technology will come along, as it has so often in the past, and deliver the prosperity that we need. The challenge is, will we be quick enough to create jobs to offset the ones that are lost? This is, a debate that goes back to the Luddites in the early 19th century. I think the most obvious threat, for example, is the most common job that an American male does is to drive something, a truck, a taxi, a van. When automated trucks and cars come along, that's a big chunk of employment to lose. And it's a question of how easy it will be to retrain those people to do the other jobs. The jobs that will come through in the future may well be in the caring professions, bathing Nigel Farage down when he's in his old age people's home. Those sorts of things, truck drivers are probably not the most eager to transfer to do. Another point of view from another thing from the point of view of prosperity is, if we are aging, as we are aging, and if immigration does come down, then the combination of those two does mean that real wages will probably have to rise if there are just fewer people around to do the work that remains. And you could imagine a world in which costs fall so fast that real wages go up, even though we don't get pay rises, we don't get nominal pay rises, but prices fall. That happened in the late 19th century. There was a big fall in prices as goods were brought over from the US and Argentina, wheat and meat and so on. And that was a time when real wages grew a lot in Britain and in the rest of Europe. And the other issue is that all the benefits of technology may not be caught by the statistics. So this has more computer power by far than the Apollo 11 when it landed on the moon. And there are a whole bunch of other things that we use that are much better, but that isn't necessarily captured in the statistics. The risk in all this, however, is the politics. So we have seen a dysfunctional political development in the last few years. The US has someone in charge who doesn't understand economics. Europe, well, his main aim was to bring down the trade deficit. It's just at a 10-year high, because if you cut taxes, then people spend a lot more, and they spend more money on imports, and the trade deficit goes up. I mean, any economist could have told him that, but he wouldn't listen to them. Europe is also caught up in political turmoil. China is slowing down. India and Pakistan, there are 1,000 political risks. In the long run, we usually muddle through, so let's hope we do now. But it will be more challenging, I think, in your jobs to deal with your workers if you find that this period continues and we have low growth and very slow rises in prosperity. Thank you very much.